Another day, another conversation. Today we're joined by Mike Goldman, who is a coach and a strategist and an author. So lots to get into. I'm going to decrease me and bring you guys in. Nobody wants to hear me talk. Mike, would love to hear just opening statement. How are you navigating things? How are you doing? How's your mindset? Any general thoughts around that would be awesome.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me, guys. So doing really well. Thank God, first and foremost, everybody's healthy. So that's number one. But, my business is working with CEOs and leadership teams to create a great leadership team and create great companies from that. And it certainly impacted my business. I normally work with my clients live and in person in their conference room. And these days I've had to pivot to doing a lot more over Zoom meetings, and thank God most of my clients are doing pretty well, and the Zoom meetings are going pretty well, so that's going okay. I'm launching a new book on Tuesday, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about, and it was a real struggle for me to figure out whether this was the perfect time to launch a book or a horrible time to launch a book. A lot of reasons why it may be a horrible time to launch a book, but for me, I think the messages in the book are something that leaders and leadership teams need now more than ever. So I've decided to launch the book, and thank God my business is going fine, and most of my clients are moving forward, albeit with some major pivots along the way.
Hey, Mike. So let's talk about the book a second. Performance breakthroughs, right?
It's called Breakthrough Leadership Team, and it's launching on April 28th.
So from two perspectives, right? The human and business impact on you and your thought process as you launch this book in the middle of this pandemic, right? But also, and what's the takeaways for business owners right now as we exist in the heart of this battle?
So bigger picture, and why I decided to launch the book, and then I'll give some quick takeaways, is companies are going to come out of this either much stronger, believe it or not. Many companies will come out much stronger, much weaker, or they may not come out at all. And what's important now is, while we're looking down and trying to get through the next weeks and make sure we've got enough cash to get our employees back up and running again and get our inventories back in line, it's important to look up as well and say, how do we make sure we're stronger on the other side of all this? And that's really the message from the book, and my message to my clients these days is, there are some things you've got to do. Number one, you've got to take care of yourself. As a leader, you've got to make sure, if you were meditating 30 minutes a day, you better be meditating an hour a day right now. You really have to keep your focus on what you want and what you don't want. So self-leadership is real important right now. Leading your team, if you are communicating with your team once a week, you should be communicating with them 3, 4, 5 times a week right now. So to make sure you are really keeping your team not only connected with what's going on at the company, but make sure you have empathy and you're not so inwardly focused. You're outwardly focused on your team. You're outwardly focused on your customers. Number 3, what are you doing to be helpful to your customers right now, not just marketing to them? What are you doing to be helpful to your vendors right now? And lastly, number 5, I'd say you've got to be focused on your cash flow. You've got to be a better steward of cash than you ever had before. And if you do all those things and continue that, you will not only survive this, but thrive and be stronger on the other side. And I think the common denominator of all those things is you've got to have a strong leadership team, what I call a breakthrough leadership team. If you've got that, or you create that, you'll be stronger on the other side. If you don't have that, it's going to be a real rough go for you.
Lots to unpack in that. Let's start with the strong leadership team. So I think there's many leaders that are self-evaluating right now. Some are saying, well, crap, we didn't have X in line. Call that third party three, and now they're scrambling because as a restaurant brand, they have no way to get their product out. So now they're playing from behind. But let's say they're having the same conversation with the team that they have. They're saying, well, we were not prepared for this. We do not have the best, most trusting leadership team possible. What advice would you give to them to take a step back? And obviously the talent pool is going to be there. The people are losing jobs, and there's going to be a percentage of folks that lose jobs that aren't talented. It is what it is. But there's going to be a percentage of people that might be on the street that could actually have impact. So what advice would you have for trying to find the reset button, and then for trying to navigate timing of bringing on someone during this craziness? How would you advise they go through that process?
Yeah, my advice for companies that may not feel like they have the best, most trusting culture right now is it's not too late, but it will be too late very soon. You've got to make sure you've got a core purpose to your organization. Why do you exist? Core values within your organization. What are those non-negotiable behaviors? If you don't have them, you better create them real quick. If you have them, they better not just be a plaque on the wall, which is what most companies have. I spent half my 30-year career working with big Fortune 500s who all had these core values plaques on the walls, but if you ask them privately what they were, they'd have to go look at the plaque to remember what they were. Now's the time that you really have to define who you are and live that. I have a client right now who I'll be honest, coming into this crisis, did not have the best, most trusting culture. We've been working really hard on it, but the CEO has really taken a leadership role of, number one, doing everything he can to make sure he's saving as many jobs as he can, which included the leadership team and himself all taking pay cuts in order to save jobs. And he's been communicating more than ever and better than ever with the rest of the team to be brutally honest about what's going on. And the one side, be brutally honest, but on the other side, make sure people understand that there's a brighter future out there. And he has gotten more calls and more emails from his team saying, I'm glad to be part of this family. I can't wait to move things forward. Hey, what can I do to help? Hey, if I take a pay cut, how many jobs could I save? It's been amazing. So I think you've got to really define who you are, live that culture right now, and you will find that you not only keep the people you have, you'll build a stronger culture, and you'll actually start to become right now, and on the other side of this, start to become a talent magnet for those A players, those superstars that are out there looking for something better.
Mike, so many concepts there about, if I just picked out a quote of define who you are and live that culture right now, right? That's pretty amazing. So we're a smaller but national franchise law firm. I've always viewed our culture as amazing, and I have an amazing team. Ironically, the last few days, I feel like I'm failing as a leader in that communication. And ironically, it's because, and I get the brutally honest conversations, I feel like I've moved inward a little. I'm working nonstop, 24/7. My goal is to build a landing pad for our team. I agree with you. If you're not building, you gave 3 scenarios, either you're coming out much stronger, weaker, or not at all, right? And I take the viewpoint of, if you're staying the same or not becoming stronger, de facto, you're becoming much weaker on the other side, right? Changed world. My whole focus has been building a landing pad and a launch pad for our team to become even stronger. As Nick will use Nick's term, building scaffolding. But it's interesting, I've sort of gone inward the last 2 days as my focus becomes cash flow, whether PPP, and it's all out of concern for keeping my team intact. And so out of that concern, I think I've become a bad leader in the last 2 days. Does that make sense?
It does. And so I'll say, you've said a couple of things that I want to unpack. And one is, while it may seem that the more you sweat and bleed and struggle through this and work 20-hour days, that you're doing what's right for your company, the first thing you've got to do is take care of yourself. And that means exercise. That means eating right. That means starting your day off with gratitude, meditation, whatever it takes, doing whatever you need to do throughout the day. What I found as a leader and a business owner is, and we're on a webinar, right? But how many webinars do we have thrown at us, and podcasts, and the learning has gone up maybe 100x over the last few weeks. And there's some great stuff out there, but you've got to prioritize, and you've got to make sure you're leading yourself, because if you're inwardly focused and you're tired and frustrated and stressed, you can say all the right things to your organization, but I don't care what words you use, you're going to come across as stressed and frustrated. And it's going to scare the heck out of everybody else within your organization. So number one, you've got to take care of yourself. And number two, you've got to be outward focused in, I would say, 3 areas. Number one, we talked about, you got to be living, it's 3 V's. Number one, you got to be living your values every single day. Number two, the second V is vision. You have to help people understand and get people involved in creating that vision of the future that gets people more excited about what's coming than scared about where they are now. So the first V is value, second is vision, and the third is the toughest one, it's vulnerability. You've got to be vulnerable yourself. You're not superhuman, and if you come across that way, people are going to think they need to be superhuman as well. You need to show your vulnerability. Let them know when you're struggling with something. And especially on your leadership team, if you show that vulnerability, they will show that vulnerability right back, and you will build a level of trust on your leadership team, and therefore build a level of trust in your organization that will allow you to get through this and not feel like you're alone, and again, allow you to be even stronger on the other side of all this.
Like when you were going through your points that you walk through, and obviously taking care of yourself ends up being one, and then the bookend ends up being, do you have the leadership team in place, and right before that is, do you have the cash flow in place? I think one of the most complex things for business operators right now is all of them actually carry somewhat equal weight right now. So you're looking at this giant pile of crap, and it's like, where do I prioritize my time? And at the same time, business leaders are working probably the most that they've ever worked in their lives for less money. So like the whole thing is so complex. So one, I would love to know, like, prioritization, right? You put yourself, but how do you carve out enough time for all of that? And secondly, I'm curious on your opinions on this, because I think about cash flow and I think about taking care of people. That there are some challenges in that, and some brands came out right off the gate and said no layoffs, and now they're almost regretting that. Maybe they didn't get the PPP loan, or maybe they just don't have enough cash flow, and now they're not going to be able to save face with their teams because they said no layoffs, and now they're going to go through it. But my take has been, right, wrong, or indifferent, someone gave me this advice that from prioritizing our cash flow, don't ask our team to take a pay cut, cut bodies. Meaning, let's go ahead and free up as much cash flow as possible to pay people what they are comfortable with or used to financially, and try to go forward that way so that you can ask, when you say go above and beyond, you haven't taken something away from them. So on your take about, do you have a perception on that as well? So obviously I said a ton there. Would love your feedback.
That's right. I don't know if you saw, but I was writing as you spoke. So I've got 2 things there. One is about, Nick, how you prioritize your time, and let's talk about, and then I'll hit the cash flow piece, and whether it's layoffs, cutting salaries, or some combination of both. From a prioritization standpoint, I stress, and I was just talking to one of my CEOs yesterday who basically asked me that same question, very overwhelmed with seemingly dozens of things they have to do, and webinars they want to watch, and books they want to read, and communications, conversations they need to have. And I asked a very simple question. I said, what do you do when you first wake up in the morning? And his answer was, he kind of jumps into the fire and opens up his email and takes a look at the voicemail and just jumps in and tries to do the best he can. And that's absolutely the wrong way to go about it. What you've got to do is you've got to start every day with, number one, doing what you need to do to take care of yourself, which may be exercise, it may be meditation, it may be gratitude, whatever that is. But then the first piece of real work I do is not to open my email or check my voicemail or look on the web or anything like that, or look at social media. The first thing I do is I get my journal out, which for me is a notepad I've got online, and I say, what are the 3, 4, or 5 most important outcomes that I'm committed to achieve today? It's not the 75 things I've got to do. I've got that list too. If I live my life off that list, I'm going to be frustrated and stressed out of my mind, and that list never ends. I guide my life off of what are the 3, 4, or 5 outcomes I'm committed to achieve today. And the outcome is not to have a meeting. The outcome is what result do you want of that meeting? So number one, I'd say you've got to boil it down to what's most important. And that's going to be a little bit different every day. So prioritization has become more important than ever. And again, I'd say from a prioritization standpoint, first thing you've got to prioritize yourself. Then you've got to prioritize your team. You've got to prioritize your customers, your vendors. And through all that, you've got to prioritize cash. It's a lot of things. You're not going to focus on all those every day. You better at least focus on yourself every day. So that's number one in terms of prioritization. In terms of cash flow, when you look at cash flow, it's about a lot more than just people. You've got to start by go kind of from the bottoms up and say, all right, what kind of cash do I have? Liquid cash do I have in the bank? And how many days worth of cash is that? And then you start layering on top, what does your pipeline look like? What does your bookings look like? What does your line of credit look like? And figure out what your cash really is. And when you do that, I'm not sure, Nick, I think I heard you say the advice you got was not to cut anybody's pay, but first look at cutting people and leave people's pay alone. I would say you've got to balance. Number one, the biggest mistake companies make is they don't take action on the C players within their organization. And I'm not saying during this pandemic. Before this, when I was writing my book, the biggest mistake CEOs told me they made when I did interviews was they kept C players, they kept low performers on their teams entirely too long. Now's the time to take care of that problem. So number one, you've got to look at who your C players are, take action, send them off to go to work for your competition once this stuff is over. So absolutely, there are people who don't belong on your team anymore. That's number one. But then I do think you have to, starting with your leadership team, ask your people to sacrifice, which may mean cutting salaries for some period of time in order to save those jobs of those high performers that you've got. So A, people see you really care, and B, you get the strong members of your team through whatever you're going through and out to the other side.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great analogy to have your C players work for your competition, right? It's interesting because I think, you've said it, a lot of businesses do struggle with that. Mike, I know there's no silver bullet, and it's funny how everything, when I look at patterns of success, especially in the franchise brands we've spoken with and the franchisees, it sounds so easy to overstate. And like you've said, you don't want it to be a plaque on the wall, but culture really does become critical for organizations, right? What's your advice right now? Like, how do we quantify, there's going to be businesses that think they're becoming stronger or will become stronger on the other side, but they're not. They're going to die. Like, I feel like this is probably in the history of human events, in a top 10 event, that is going to alter society in a way that we can't even understand, whether it's, monetary systems on the other side, nations, war, business, whatever it is. So how do you know if, like, objectively as a team, you're grappling with this the right way to make yourself stronger? Because there's going to be a lot of people with those plaques on the walls, and there's going to be a lot of people that think they've survived this, and then 3 years later, they're going to realize they were dead already.
Well, I think that there's kind of the hard numbers way of looking at it, and then the softer numbers. I think, you've got to look at through this crisis and on the other side of this crisis, you've got to look at your business as you always did. You've got to look at your top and bottom line growth. Is your revenue starting to grow, or in this case, is it starting to shrink less eventually? What about your bottom line? What's happening with your bottom line, and where is that trending? So I think part of it is you've got to look at the numbers, but you've also got to look at on the softer side, there are ways to look at your culture, ways to look at the level of engagement that you have on your leadership team and cascading down throughout your organization, whether that is something called the Net Promoter Score, which is a gauge of how engaged. There's a Net Promoter Score which gauges how engaged your customers are, or you can use an employee Net Promoter Score to gauge how engaged your employees are. So you want to start seeing, either through the emails and phone calls coming back, through the intelligence your leadership team is gathering, what's going on with your culture? Are people more engaged than ever and passionate about you getting to the other side, or are they going to, look for the lifeboats? Look for the lifeboats as soon as they get a chance. So I think you've got to look at top and bottom line growth. You've got to look at your engagement and passion within your organization, whether that's strengthening or getting weaker. You've got to look at the value that you're adding. I mean, in my mind, a great company is doing three things. Number one, it's top and bottom line growth. Number one, they're providing a learning, growing, fulfilling environment for their employees. Number three, they're adding value to society. And value to society means they're adding real value to their clients, or it could mean they're adding real value to society in general. So those are three ways to look at it. There are also assessments you could use. I actually have, if you go to my website, mike-goldman.com, there's something called the Breakthrough Leadership Team Assessment that looks at, I really do believe, as your leadership team goes, so goes the rest of the organization. And there are, in that assessment, 6 different ways to assess your leadership team and whether you're heading in the right direction. It's going to assess it from the standpoint of, are each leaders, are you guys managing yourselves and doing self-leadership in the right way? Do you have the right structure of your leadership team? Do you have the right people on your leadership team? Number 3. Number 4, do you have the right culture on your leadership team? Number 5, are you executing with discipline as a leadership team? Even with this pandemic, holding each other accountable, executing with discipline is more important than ever. And then number 6 is, are you continuing to develop and improve as a leadership team? Even in this environment, you've got to assess all 6 of those areas. And if you're not learning and growing and moving that forward, pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID, if you're not learning and growing in all those areas, then you're going to die either slowly or quickly.
First, a comment, Mike. I do my to-do list the same way, however that turns in. So I put my 3 things that I'm getting done every day. And actually, we lead our leadership meetings starts in the morning. We do one before we open it up to the staff, where we go through 3 or 4 things that we're going to get done so that there's accountability. So one, I appreciate that statement, but my overall statement on just the fundamentals, there's still so many unknowns of what happens outside of this. So it's all guesswork on how do you be an effective leader in here, because we don't know what happens next. From a comment standpoint, and I would love your feedback on this. What I think about is even your comment with the C players, right? So if we go back to 2008, most companies eliminated their C players when you're going through a really turbulent economy. But then our memories to get lost in the shuffle because as time goes on, now all of a sudden, like, yeah, let's add bodies back in here. And we almost lost, we lost what it felt like to have nothing. So we've been trained for a moment like this with 2008 and even 2001. So my belief is this is the first time that we've seen political, health, financial panic all get like blended in together. That it's a very complex scenario, but if we lean back and we look at some of the previous scenarios of our leadership careers, there's been moments that at least give us that scaffolding. My question is, I feel like as much of a bullshit question this was on job interviews to say, tell me what your 5 or 10 year plan is, like we got to be thinking about the 10-year plan now, because if we look at a run rate from September, from 2008, you're talking about somewhere between 10 and 12 years. Like our full recovery, we're fat and happy, might be 10 years from now. So if you take a back step and you start planning through this process now to say, here are some of the milestones as we re-navigate this, is that kind of what we start looking at? And for franchising, it's somewhat good because that's typically what the agreement is. It's a 10-year agreement. So I think it changes our planning. It might not be just like quarter by quarter. That might be the baby steps, but we might have to look at a 10-year recovery here. And what does it look like? And how do we separate out a plan? I just want your opinions on that.
Yeah, I'm going to take two things because you started off, Nick, talking about C players, and I want to make a comment on that, and then I'll go to the planning piece. Is the interesting thing is, we talk a lot about how you need to lead through this pandemic. For the leadership teams I've been working with for a while that I would say are great leadership teams, what I would call breakthrough leadership teams, honestly, they haven't had to change all that much because they were doing it before. And specifically related to C players, one of the things I do with my clients on a quarter-by-quarter basis is we get together as a leadership team and we do a talent assessment. We look at who the A players are, who the B players are, who the C players are every quarter. And my coaching to them is when you've got a C player, it's okay to say, okay, I'm going to coach that person. But when we get together 90 days from now, if that C player is still a C player, you might be the C player as a leader. So there's accountability on my leadership teams that I work with to deal with this C player issue, not just wait until the economy is bad. So a great team is going to do that all the time. So I wanted to hit that first. Secondly, as it relates to planning, my strong clients have already, over the last couple of weeks, have already started to pick their heads up from just managing the crisis day in and day out, pick their heads up and look towards the future. And again, great leadership teams are doing that all the time, not just now, where they're looking at their 10 to 15 year big, hairy, audacious goal. And that's kind of the flag on top of the mountain. From there, they're looking at what I call a 3HAG. 3HAG stands for 3-year highly achievable goal. And they're looking at what market are they going to own over the next 3 years? What are they going to be known for over the next 3 years? They can take that back to a year and to a quarter, and you're coming up with your plans quarter by quarter. This is not the time to say, we're just going to look at the next week or two. This is the time to look back up and say, all right, you know what? This doesn't change where we want to be 10 or 15 years from now. This doesn't change the mountain we're climbing and the flag on top of the mountain. Does this change where we think we could be 3 years from now? Maybe, maybe not. I would argue it doesn't have to if you do the right things. But if it does change where you plan to be 3 years from now, kind of that base station on the mountain before you get to the flag on top of the mountain, let's talk about that as a leadership team. And let's make sure we're all marching to the same tune. And then let's look at it and say, okay, if that's where we want to be 3 years from now, where do we need to be by the end of this year, by the end of 2020? And then every quarter, you're reworking your plan to get there. What I don't want to see is organizations reworking their 10-year plan and then say, okay, now here's our 10-year plan. And maybe in 3 years from now, we'll create another plan. No. You've got to be replanning every 90 days with your eyes focused on 10 years out, 3 years out. Where do I need to be in the next 90 days? And pivot and shift as you need to.
Charles, can I just add one thing to that?
Please.
I agree with you 100%. I think the mistake that happened 10 years ago is we didn't plan understanding the moment and how we felt, like panic, uncomfortable, layoffs, businesses declining. We plan like, yay, this is what it's going to look like in the future. But it's like, if you can bottle up how nervous you feel now and somehow hold on to it at each of these milestones along the way, then when we get to 10 years from now, we're a little bit heavier on cash on hand. We're preparing for a rainy day. We're evaluating our C players. We're focusing on ourselves. Like all the advice that we're getting hammered with right now through webinars, then maybe we think about navigating this a little bit differently. That's what I would encourage all brands to like don't forget this moment 10 years from now, because if you do and this happens again, or it crashes or whatever happens 10 years from now, you're going to be in the exact same spot because you plan like, yay, it's going to be so beautiful. But the reality is like even like weather patterns, it might be a perfect day today, but that cloud is going to come in and wreck your perfect day tomorrow, you know? And if you plan that way, then maybe there's value.
Yeah, as long as, I agree, my response to that is as long as thinking about that doesn't paralyze you, right? As long as it's not, but what if this goes wrong? But what if this goes wrong? We can't invest here because what if all of a sudden a new pandemic happens 3 months from now, we run out of cash? If you think that way, it's going to paralyze you. What you've got to do is you've got to build an organization, and I always say it starts at the leadership team. You've got to build a resilient organization that is not going to expect and predict when the next pandemic is going to happen or the next collapse or the next mortgage crisis or whatever it is, but a team that's resilient enough to deal with it. One of my favorite leadership teams I work with, great leadership teams, about 3 weeks before the shit really hit the fan on all of this, really started thinking about this. We did a SWOT around strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats around the coronavirus, and they were already buying all of their people laptops with the thought of we may need to all start working from home. And this is before anyone was really taking this stuff really seriously. They were resilient enough and strong enough to start thinking about it. You need to build a leadership team that has the ability to do that.
Okay, I think that's a great point about bottling up the moment, right? Because it's forging something in fire. This moment will never exist again in our lives in this way. Mike, what struck me is, I guess I've been trained as a person, 100% accountability. So business success is a function of hard work and whatever. And I to the point of over-indexing, never saying anything was lucky or whatever. And if I don't hit a certain level, it's a function of me and my leadership. What was interesting when Nick and I spoke with Annie Duke, not that it takes away from that perspective I have, but I had a blind spot, I feel, because her whole perspective is you also need to evaluate chances of luck and plan for those moments. Because if you don't plan for chances of luck on the upside or downside, then you're not fully evaluating implementing hedges. And that to me was very eye-opening. And another point she made is, a lot of successful people stop being successful because they give too much credit to what they did and not credit to maybe some of the luck along the way. How do you feel about that? And how do you put that into your framework when you're working with your clients on planning and succeeding and moving forward?
Yeah, and I love that concept. And Jim Collins has a book called Great by Choice. And in Great by Choice, he talks about this concept of return on luck. And that's what you're really talking about. How do we get return on luck? Either return on that good luck that happens and we're ready and prepared for it, or getting hit less hard by the bad luck, or even better, taking some of that bad luck, pivoting and turning it into something you never thought possible, that you never would have thought of before. And I think to do that, you've got to have a combination of two things that seem like they're at odds with each other, but you've got to do them both at the same time. Number one, You have to build that flexibility as an organization and creativity as an organization to be able to pivot and look at things in a different way and zig and zag when you need to. But at the same time, you need to build that discipline and that structure to say, this is who we are and this is the way we do things. For example, three of the real disciplines that I work with my clients on, are number one, are we aligned around priorities? Like we talked about, every 90 days reworking that plan. Are we aligned around what's most important every day, every week, every month, every quarter? So alignment around priorities, number one. Number two, are we measuring the right things so we understand what success is and know how we're doing? Number three, do we have the right planning and communication rhythms so that we've got that structure and that discipline, but we are talking about the right things with the right people at the right time. So when something happens outside of our control, we can deal with it. Either something happens outside of our control in a negative way, we can deal with it, or whether there's that opportunity out there, we can zig and zag and deal with that as well. So it's this weird combination of creativity and flexibility with structure and discipline.
It's great feedback. And look, all of these conversations the aggregate is going to create enough information to hopefully give people the ability to figure out how to navigate this thing. Mike, we obviously appreciate all the time that you've given and the stories and collateral that you've given to help navigate this. Any final thoughts as we take the final turn?
The final thought I would have is just remember that as you as the CEO, if you're listening to this, or your leadership team, as your leadership team goes, so goes the rest of the organization. So if you are stressed and scared and frustrated as a leader or as a leadership team, take that and multiply it by 5 as you cascade it down the rest of the organization. If you are siloed as a leadership team and sales is getting angry with service, who's getting angry with operations, then again, multiply that as you go down throughout the organization. But if you are, something called the Stockdale paradox, which says at the same time, you've got to be brutally honest about what's going on, brutally honest about today's reality, but at the same time, have that vision of a much better future. If you've got that and you need that as a leader, and you cascade that down throughout your leadership team and the rest of your organization, you will come out stronger on the other side. And the way I think about my business and the way I encourage my clients to think about their business is that I just know in my heart that a year from now, I'm going to look back on this time and I'm going to say, it's a horrible time. Hope it never happens again. Wouldn't wish it to happen ever again. But you know what? My company and my clients are actually, in a weird way, much better off, because if that didn't happen, we never would have pivoted the way we pivoted. We never would have the relationships we have now. We wouldn't have had that return on luck on some of those opportunities that we have now. We wouldn't have the strong culture and trust we have now. Man, I wish it never happened, but it feels weird saying this. We're better off because of it. I know in my heart that's what I'm going to be saying a year from now about my business, and I hope for everybody listening, you're saying the same things about your business.
Mike, I think that's an amazing statement. And just reflecting internally, it's weird. I feel like I got two different people going on, because I know in my heart we're doing the right thing and we are going to be stronger. And I tell my wife this, whether additional funding or not, and the not getting additional funding will make us more money than the funding would have given us. So it's strange. And talking about, there's a pattern going on, as Nick alluded to in these conversations, and there's something very powerful in the community and the advice you offered. And I know this for sure. If this tragedy didn't happen, I wouldn't be having this conversation with you today, and I'd be worse off for that. I would be in my isolated little world where I think I'm in control and everything's so perfect. And And so this is a moment really to look out and readjust that horizon. So I really appreciate, Mike, you spending the time with us, because I could tell you amazing value that you offer, and I really do appreciate that.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate the time, and hopefully it was of some value for your audience. It's been fun.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Appreciate the conversation.